Welcome, everyone, to the Free Assange Vigil 48. Tonight we have a special guest, Kevin Gosztola. I'm joined tonight by my co-hosts, Andrew Zigman and Steve Poikinen, and I am Kendra Christian. Today marks day 3,465 since the illegal and arbitrary detention of Julian Assange, 418 days since he was trafficked out of the Ecuadorian embassy after being sold for a 4.2 billion IMF loan to Ecuador, 97 days until the second phase of the extradition hearings, 1,095 days of incarceration for Reality Winner, and 81 days of freedom for Chelsea Manning since the decade-long WikiLeaks grand jury dismissal. Couple points here. We are fundraising to go to Washington, D.C. for the entire span of the next extradition hearing, which is in September. So we will have our GoFundMe link. If you can't donate, that's fine. But if you can share and help us out, that would be really great. And then Andrew will also be posting actions for the week. So with that, I will turn it over to our co-hosts.
So, first of all, thanks for being on, Kevin. That was you were with us when we did our World Press Freedom Day event, and that was a whole big fat bag of awesome. I think personally, as we get closer to the second phase of Julian's extradition, Kendra just said 97 days. Where do you think the world's going to be in 97 days? They're rolling like heavy duty military equipment down the street in DC right now.
Yeah, so at the moment, the prosecution of Julian Assange seems to be poised to become a symbol for military dictatorship when you really begin to break it down. We've got images right now being shared by a journalist in the mainstream media, Martha Raddatz, of armed police officers lined up on the Lincoln Memorial steps, armed to the teeth, wearing helmets, looking like stormtroopers that are about to be deployed by Donald Trump to take over Washington, D.C., the streets of Washington, D.C. And I think the images that we're seeing say a lot about how they respect or absolutely do not respect the First Amendment. The fact that the sort of force we're seeing deployed against people who are engaged in speech right now is being targeted with tear gas. We're seeing pepper spray, we're seeing flashbang grenades deployed. We've seen rubber bullets. That's been outside of Washington, D.C. And Donald Trump is encouraging this kind of militarized police force, even saying in parts of the United States where governors are not handling it properly, that are not using enough force to bring this movement to its knees, these protests, and squelch them, that he's going to send military into these states to basically occupy and set up checkpoints. I mean, we're seeing this like apartheid style development of different security areas throughout the country, especially around urban cities. So what does that mean for Julian Assange? What does that have to do with freeing Julian Assange? Well, it has to do with the fact that, depending on what activists do, depending on how we make this an issue, I think the globe is really starting to question what the United States commitment really is to principles of press freedom. We've seen so many images over the last week to 2 weeks of journalists being shot by rubber bullets. We've seen people being threatened, and we've seen journalists cuffed and handcuffed. We've seen journalists handcuffed on air during broadcasts. Most vividly was the black journalist on CNN who was taken into custody while he was in the middle of doing a live report on CNN. And so, let's not dismiss the fact that right now I don't expect, obviously, let me clarify, I don't expect Donald Trump's administration to change at all. But what I'm trying to say is right now, as far as the image of the United States goes, there is a cost that is developing to prosecuting Julian Assange. And I think you're going to have a tough time convincing countries that there's a difference between prosecuting Julian Assange and what is happening on the streets during these demonstrations. I think you're going to hear from a lot of officials, especially in Europe and throughout, let's say, Australia and New Zealand and other parts like that, that they're going to say that they don't see much of a difference and that they lump it in. Then maybe that might turn some parts of the world into being more sympathetic to what's going on with Julian Assange, because as we learn about what his current condition is, his health condition is in Belmarsh during COVID-19 and this pandemic that still hasn't gone away, we know that there are a number of officials who are stepping up that had not spoken out before, who are willing to advocate for him being released on bail from the Belmarsh prison so that he can be kept on home confinement and not risk his life during this pandemic.
You're muted, Steve.
God damn it. We have seen movement out of the Australian Parliament, finally, whereas it had been like a working group of about a half a dozen MPs. There's now significantly more people coming forward, starting to, I guess, act like they just found out all of this information. Like, oh my goodness, did you know there was a guy in Belmont and there's COVID there and maybe you should do something about this.
And his teeth are falling out and he's got shoulder problems. Did you know he's really in bad shape? Yeah.
Yeah. And but look, man, even if they're going to pretend like it's brand new information, at least there's being attention drawn to it, where previously it had been, us. And organizations like Doctors for Assange, Barristers for Assange, and the Council of Europe put out a pretty definitive statement a while back, but that was kind of it. It was a general blanket statement in support of Julian Assange in general, but persecuted journalists overall. And then that was kind of it, because COVID-19 happened and the entire world went batshit crazy, and then got to sit in their houses for 3.5 months until it got nice and hot and everybody went out into the street en masse. Are you go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, and then theoretically it's still spreading, so who knows what we've accomplished. And the fact that we haven't been able to rein in this pandemic is a serious issue for Julian Assange, because it means we don't get to this extradition hearing that we need to have. So let's keep in mind here that this was supposed to happen in May. If you and me talking right now, we had everything not been upended by a global pandemic, we'd be talking about some really important testimony that witnesses for the defense had just put on the record about why it's wrong for Julian Assange to be extradited and prosecuted under the Espionage Act in the United States. We would have had a lot to talk about that I think reveal the way an espionage operation was carried out against Julian Assange. But we can't have that conversation. So it's important for people to understand that the failure to stop the spread of the pandemic isn't just an issue for us. It's an issue for Julian Assange and when this is all going to come to an end, because we're already looking at, before this started, we were already looking at an extradition process that was potentially going to take 4 to 5 years. So what does this do? Does this mean now it's 5 to 6, 6 to 7? What's going on? This pandemic means that Julian Assange is probably going to lose 6 to 7 years of his life unless there's a political change that happens within the halls of power in the U.S. government.
Yeah, because it's a clearly politically motivated attack on free press, attack on free speech, and a personal attack on Julian Assange. And the lack of significant political players who are willing to come forward and merely state the obvious. This is a political persecution of a journalist. Takes zero courage to do that, or it seems like it takes zero courage to do that, and minimal brains for that matter. Like if you've got a half a dozen brain cells to rub together, you could come to the conclusion that this is a politically motivated offense that's being put forth by the part of multiple world governments with a very specific target. And the fact that there's a treaty that says you can't extradite based on political offenses should be all it takes for anyone in media to, or anyone in politics really, to step up and say that. As fucked up as this is gonna sound, I hope that if anything positive comes out of targeting journalists through the protests, it's that they draw the parallel between what's happening to them in the streets and the fact that Julian Assange is languishing away in the Guantanamo Bay of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and the fact that any one of these journalists on the street right now could, obviously for a much shorter amount of time, but end up in jail and prison, and for a 24-hour period, maybe, let's say, experience that feeling that they're being exposed to these bodies that they don't know where they've been, and they don't know who's taking care of what, or also these guards. I mean, I actually talk a lot about incarceration and mass incarceration in the United States. I join John Kiriakou and Brian Becker on their Loud and Clear radio show every week on Thursdays. They do this criminal injustice half hour. We talk about mass incarceration in the United States. And what's important to consider here is that I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
One thing I was wondering, Kevin, is if you've seen, I don't keep track of the mainstream outlets too much, and I know that certainly there have been things that have been caught live on camera of journalists being assaulted during these. But do you see that as part of even the narrative push? Or they, do we see that even really being highlighted, that these other than, independent outlets and people on Twitter and things like that, are you seeing that, highlighted amongst the mainstream community? Or?
No, I don't think that it's. See, the problem is that these dissident journalists, or these activist journalists, as maybe you would want to call them, although I'm not really sure that they're engaged in activism. Like, there's a group in the country, Unicorn Riot, that does some important work on the ground, and I just think that CNN and other more mainstream journalists don't see them the same, because like a group like Unicorn Riot, or even like, let's take a group like WikiLeaks, would care about what people are fighting for on the ground right now, might actually agree with 100% or 110% with what the goals are of the activists going out into the streets, and want to allow that protest and not see it squelched and cut off by these curfews that are in place. And so they don't see themselves as being the same as Julian Assange. And that's something that I've noticed in following the reaction to Julian Assange's indictment and the way that he's been treated. It's the compartmentalization. They've convinced themselves that Julian Assange is not a journalist, even though that is absolutely not true. And I do think it's actually important to challenge. We have Democratic politicians who have stepped forward, some of them who ran for president, and they said things like, I don't support Julian Assange, or I don't like Julian Assange, or I don't necessarily think Julian Assange is a journalist, but I absolutely oppose prosecuting someone under the First Amendment, under the Espionage Act, and I absolutely oppose targeting people in this manner in a way that's going to set back press freedom. But I don't like that qualifying statement, because it's a very powerful way to undermine solidarity and support for Julian Assange. So you're conceding that he's not a journalist because it's politically unpopular to support Julian Assange, because that's what Nils Meltzer has documented in his work covering the way in which the governments of Ecuador, the United Kingdom, the U.S., and Sweden all came together, encouraging public mobbing and character assassination and basically the systematic torture that went on inside of the Ecuador embassy, the kind of pressure campaign that was carried out in order to make him go crazy while he was inside the embassy. This is clear to everyone that this is what has happened to Assange, and yet they just don't believe that he is a journalist who should be given this protection.
So with that CNN video that we keep referencing, if people haven't seen it, to me it looks, at least in part, very, very staged. And I think it actually speaks more towards what you're explaining, like this privileged class of journalists in the mainstream, where this person at CNN probably didn't think this was going to happen. They thought they were going to show up, do a hoorah for the police, because even behind him, you see like this wall of police officers, and it just feels very theatrical the way that they march out and surround them and shit. But I think to a larger extent, that's designed to almost sow fear amongst the dissident class and the activists and the actually independent journalists, for them to go out and, okay, they see on TV CNN get arrested. What the fuck is going to happen to me when I'm just Jim Bob with a gimbal and a camera attached to it? So I think it's also designed to be as much of a shock and awe campaign against journalism as it is to perpetuate the violence against journalists in and of itself.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at a really good point here, which is that CNN doesn't have to be afraid of the police, because even if they're uncomfortable as the police drag them off and in handcuffs, even if it's embarrassing for this to be happening to them on air, they know they have really strong legal counsel that's going to be able to bail people out of jail right away. That's not something that a lot of independent journalists have, who have faced the brunt of this. I mean, it's amazing when you think about the history of WikiLeaks and how it tracks with the political transformations that we've seen going on in the last around 10 years now, because a lot of this all goes back to the widespread Occupy movement that was happening in the United States. And that was when we first started to see how police would target people. That was when I think a lot of Americans and then others around the world started to wake up. I know that there was an Occupy London. I know that there were different Occupies throughout the world where we saw police responses to people. And I remember WikiLeaks being out there, and that was something that was supported. And so I think when you think about it, CNN knows that it can protect itself legally with its strong legal department. And it feels like it can talk to the government and negotiate the kinds of charges that Julian Assange is facing. And let's say that they would accidentally do national security journalism that wasn't all about maintaining access to sources within the NSA or the Pentagon. Let's just pretend that like they stumble upon something that they seem to care about and want to expose. Like, let's say, for example, they learn how Donald Trump is plotting to deploy the military in our cities in the United States. And they go and report that, and they reveal intelligence, and they maybe expose some kind of sensitive procedure. And they find themselves vulnerable to the Espionage Act. Well, I think they probably believe that they could talk the FBI or talk the Justice Department out of prosecuting one of their own. But I don't have that luxury. If I was the one who had that source and I was able to expose how Donald Trump is planning to start military occupations throughout the United States and what he's going to do, and I laid out a roadmap and had a source or something, I don't get to just haggle and negotiate with the Justice Department to not be charged with felonies. And neither does Julian Assange. Neither does anyone on the WikiLeaks team get to convince people that they shouldn't be charged. So I think what Julian Assange's prosecution and the effort to extradite him exposes is this gap in between how people are treated. There's a professional journalist class that gets to have protections, that gets to challenge the government and how they're treated. And to some degree, that's because they usually play ball. They usually will not publish if they're told not to. We have multiple examples of journalists not publishing stories that we needed to read. Instantly comes to mind are the warrantless wiretapping stories that were supposed to come out when George W. Bush was president. But in fact, the New York Times decided to sit on this story until George W. Bush was reelected in 2004. We've had stories about Saudi Arabian drone bases that were withheld, that the New York Times knew that they could have published and exposed, but they didn't want to reveal that we had secret drone bases in Saudi Arabia. Things of that nature are what we're talking about here, that make it so they are given more deference, that they get to defend their journalists. And that's not something that WikiLeaks has. I mean, even though what's fascinating about the upcoming hearing and what's been good about the last 1 week hearing is that we got to see that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks really did care about the material that they were publishing, that they really were responsible about it, that other journalists that worked with them did feel like they had ethics and they did take care. And that's something that if you read most of the mainstream press, you would think that Julian and a bunch of the other people handling the material were just reckless. Or if you look at the character assassinations in the press, you basically walk away with a narrative of like Julian went rogue on everyone in handling the releases that came from Chelsea Manning. And that's not true. If you listen to this testimony that's going on the record in his extradition case, you have people from Der Spiegel saying like he put more security precautions on the material than anything that they had ever worked on when it came to the cables. And there were phone calls into the government, into the Pentagon, asking them to help with redactions so that they could protect people. When they lost control of the State Department cables, it was, surprisingly, I'm going to call into the State Department and give them a warning that you've just lost control of this material and you really need to be concerned that people might get hurt. And that's not the image that we've been fed of Julian. That's a completely different image. And it's a different image than what CNN and the mainstream press has fed us about Julian Assange.
Kevin, I'm wondering what you think about, when I see these protests going, and also just even the media coverage and any mass protests these days. We know it kind of doesn't happen without the mainstream media, kind of covering it as well. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, just, how important is it for this to really, especially the peaceful protesters who are out there, for something really, really valid, that do you think that if we can't turn people's mind away from this propaganda, do you think there's hope for this to really end up meaning anything? Or, how important is that? Do you think that we, that people become aware of that? Obviously, it's very important, but do you think there's a real opportunity here for people to sort of recognize this propaganda for what it is?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say that I think this isn't going to happen and go away. I do see it potentially having a lasting impact. I don't think the U.S. is the only place that has undergone this. I do think that other countries throughout the world, but let's consider that this is the way I view it. So in a span of 6 months here, we've seen some incredibly dramatic action take place by elites, and elites that really are no friend of Assange. They're against WikiLeaks. They've made it clear, and I'm particularly outspoken against Democrats in this respect because I think we have to single them out very severely when it comes to the lack of opposition to the prosecution of Assange. Because while it is not part of the indictment, and I'm very careful about how far we go into a conversation about this material, they have not forgiven WikiLeaks for providing transparency to the Democratic Party through the Podesta emails back in 2016. And that has gone a long way towards number of people staying silent and or actively working to make it impossible for Julian Assange to defend himself so that he could get free, so that he would find some way to get to safety and no longer be trapped in the Ecuador embassy. So if you look at the last 6 months and you think about like safety valves, and you think about the way that the population could create change and how movements could affect the system and bring about some kinds of liberation for some people, reforms to the system. I'm not necessarily making an endorsement here. I'm just objectively talking about this. But the Bernie Sanders campaign was viewed as a way for a lot of radical people to have their voices heard. And that was something that I saw people who supported Occupy Wall Street and people who supported Black Lives Matter. They were actively working through that campaign to try to affect some change. And I'm not here to judge tactics. I'm just saying objectively, that was crushed by the Democratic Party. President Barack Obama, who obviously was no friend of WikiLeaks when he was president, actively made sure that that was not available. And I mean, just to be clear, had a Bernie Sanders become president, Julian Assange's prosecution would probably go away. But there's a huge question mark if Joe Biden's going to be in the White House. And that's because Joe Biden has actually called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist back in 2010. We have that vivid video clip without him parsing language. So let's get beyond the politics. Bernie's out of the picture. Now you have this pandemic. Everyone is being crushed economically. We have 40 million people in this country without jobs. And that distress starts to change people. That radicalizes people. That starts to get people waking up to the system. I think that opens people's minds and gets them to dig into these individual cases. I think that makes them more receptive to what has this country been doing to Julian Assange? What are they doing to Reality Winner? What are they doing to Chelsea Manning? I really want to learn about these whistleblowers and how they get silenced when they challenge the system. And then now you see with another cycle of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been existent in some form in this country since 2014, that people are very upset, righteously angry at the police and the power that they have. And it's been 6 years that we've been trying to rein in the power that police have to get away with killing citizens. And that's waking up people. People are going out to protest a murder that was captured on video, and they're being crushed by police force. And that's going to wake people up. And I think, especially when you look at all the young people that are leading the protests and demonstrations, and how you really see a generational divide in America. And essentially, anyone who is about ready to retire has kind of checked out of the struggle, it would seem. And not to say that there aren't older people who really do care, but like by and large, I do get the sense that this like boomer generation is responsible, especially if they're elites. I mean, I think I'll distinguish there. I'm not trying to make a blanket statement about ages. There's definitely a ton of older folks that have Julian Assange's back. But when you look at elites, when you look at the people who have managed to get elected, it's these 60 plus, 70s, 80 dinosaurs who need to get out of Congress and let people have a chance to lead, because everything they have to say about how it should be run is totally antiquated, and it's just making people's lives worse. And I think that's sort of like what we get with Julian Assange, because how many people who are below 40 really believe that WikiLeaks is just some outfit being funded entirely as some cutout operation that Russia can use to discredit the United States. And so we need to prosecute Julian Assange. I think that that's a fantasy of people who are in their 70s and 80s who lived through the Cold War and still think that that's the way the world works. And, you know, I don't think about that. And I think that, like, we're seeing with this pandemic, people waking up to the way the globe is laid out and where the United States fits. And it doesn't reflect well. I mean, I've seen things happen in the last 3 or 4 months that suggest that China, as far as their government goes, has behaved more honorably than the United States in terms of trying to help people get through the pandemic and offering supplies and resources. And so right now, what you really have going on here with the Julian Assange prosecution is something that could very well drag this empire down another notch, down another level in terms of how people view it around the world. I mean, it's a power. It has a lot of influence. I don't expect that to go away, but it looks like a country in decline. I mean, I feel like I'm living in a failed state right now. And I think that there are a number of things that if the world believes that America has become a failed state, there's a lot that can be done. I think there's a lot that activists have in their power to embarrass the United States and to make it, to show everyone that prosecuting Julian Assange is an example of what a failed state would do. It's like a failed state that doesn't have any respect for freedom and democracy would target Julian Assange with extradition and try to bring him to this country and put him on trial under the First Amendment. Because, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, very basically, just to conclude my answer here, if you bring Julian Assange to the United States, what the prosecutors would like to be able to do with Julian is put him on trial and charge him with a U.S. law. But they would like us all to believe that because he's a foreign person and is from Australia, he does not have any First Amendment rights. That's not consistent. You can't have it. You can't charge him under a U.S. law and take away and say that he's not able to use any of our Bill of Rights. You know, he would still have right to privacy, right to not be cruelly and inhumanely punished, or right to not have cruel and unusual punishment under the Fifth Amendment. He'd have all of these different rights under the Constitution because you're now bringing in U.S. law. So you can't have it both ways. You can't prosecute Julian on U.S. soil for violating the Espionage Act and then also say that he doesn't have First Amendment rights. So I think there's the way that the U.S. government is going about prosecuting him. It's already evidence of a failed state because the Justice Department is making an incoherent argument about the authority they have to prosecute Julian Assange. That, you know, even the most basic people who have a basic understanding of press freedom and free speech and freedom of expression are scratching their heads going, well, that doesn't really make sense. So you can't do that. That wouldn't be something that any country could get away with. You couldn't prosecute someone, but then tell them that they don't have the same privileges and rights that you would normally grant defendants under the law.
Well,
No.
you can do that if you have an inherently corrupt system built solely of alliances between money and nothing else.
Yeah.
Because that's really what it comes down to. Even Julian getting transferred out of the Ecuadorian embassy to Belmarsh, even though it was in the benefit of these oligarchs to do so, it still took a $4.2 billion international monetary loan fund that moved the nation of Ecuador into revolution before this whole pandemic even started. So literally the financial cost and the social cost of persecuting Julian Assange and the cost to otherwise relatively stable countries across the world is enormous.
Yeah.
I think that to just kind of go back a little bit to where one of your answers was, Kevin. The reason, at least that I've noticed, that we don't see a lot of the people who came out of the boomer generation who were in the streets in the late 60s and in the early 70s that didn't somehow get institutional security in one way or another, be it through academia or through politics, or through a business venture, is because they died from lack of health care. And we don't, we don't have a lot of those people around anymore. One that we do is the Reverend Annie Chambers, who grew up in the Black Panthers. Her brother was Malcolm X's lieutenant. She's been on my show a few times now, and she is like, she's in a wheelchair, but she's ready to throw down. You know, like when she was a teenager, she was part of the Razor Brigade in the Panthers. And if you don't know what the Razor Brigade was, for the people that are watching, whenever you see pictures from the civil rights actions in the 60s, and you see cops with their guns beating them into the crowd, they had ice picks or like scratch-alls, screwdriver, whatever they could tape that was sticking out just enough to when they hit someone with the butt of their gun, it would stick them. So the Panthers came up with an idea that I don't even have a knife handy because it's in my pocket. Oh, wait, no, here we go. So you take this part, just this part, and you keep it up under your hat or even tucked into your mouth. And when they come by, you slice them. When they come up to you, you cut them. And the point was, for the Black Panthers, is if we're going to get the shit beat out of us, regardless of what we do, we're going to send some people home bleeding too. And I'm not advocating violence in your protest movement, but what I'm saying is, like, the lack of fear, the training that the Black Panthers went through, and they went to Cuba to do it. And they met with Castro, and that's where they learned, like, if you're gonna go down the street, don't roll less than like 10 deep. You know, it's when you get caught off in groups of 1, 2, 3, or 4 people that you can get swarmed on, jumped, and have the crap kicked out of you. Like, these are lessons that can be applied to what's going on right now. Kevin, I want to throw something at you. Do you think that we could see a resurgence of Occupy coming out of this?
That's a good question. I look at what is being broadcast on CNN because they've been showing these aerial photos of every single city where you can see just the way these protests just stretch on for miles, it seems. I mean, in almost all major cities, it's like during the daytime, and these are weekdays, during the daytime, you got like 3,000 and 4,000 people marching through the streets, which is unheard of. I mean, most of the time you think the weekend would be when you would see those kinds of protests. Of course, some of these cities are still shut down from COVID, so I think that adds to it. And then some of these businesses are shutting down because they're afraid that they're going to get looted, and they're missing the message entirely. And they should be listening to the protesters and worrying less about the windows that they think are going to get broken. But I feel like it's possible. I mean, it's the summertime, right? So it's possible that we could see protesters try to reclaim space. I will say that the one problem that is working against a resurgence of Occupy, a return to that as a tactic, is because, the elites have learned. They learned all the lessons from when they crushed Occupy back in 2010. And I think they would be ready for it and would stamp it out pretty immediately, or at least would want to. I mean, we could probably go to the spaces where encampments were back in 2010 and 2011 and see the types of things they may have built in that space so that tents wouldn't be put up there again, or There's a tactic. It's not unique to the United States, but of building up these kinds of like defensive structures where it's hard for homeless people to sleep on park benches, or where it's impossible for them to put up tents under the viaducts, or under the highways where they might go seek shelter. And so they do this, they push people out. And so my sense is that wherever people would go, well, I guess they could just not go to the same space, and they could find a new space to occupy that would allow them. But I think you raise a good point, because what we're seeing right now is a really definitive moment where people are making their voices heard on a regular basis. And what could happen is that they take up some space to get their message out. I think what's fascinating to me about this moment versus 10 years ago is that I feel like elites in this country are at least conceding that the message is legitimate. I'm not sure that back when Occupy Wall Street was protesting and they were putting forward their demands, there were a lot of people who would say that, I'm not sure if they would directly say that they didn't agree with what was being said, but they would shit all over them and basically be like, this is not how change is made. You need to go vote. Kids, you need to go participate in our democracy. This isn't, you don't sit in the parks and tell people how you're going to change the world and expect that's going to happen overnight. And they would judge them, and they would say that they weren't dressing right and they were dirty, and they would mock them, and that was the way that they got treated. But here, like, I've seen this really incredible thing where it feels like people in power at least know that there's a lot of legitimacy behind what people are going around and saying. And I've been surprised, actually, that there have been Republicans who agree that what they saw in that video was a murder, and they're not defending the police officers in that video, because I didn't expect them to actually have even that basic level of humanity.
It's not just Justin Amash this time.
Yeah, I didn't expect that. So I think that, like, it is possible that we could see throughout the country that people try to reestablish a presence. And if that happens, that's good for cases like Julian Assange and everyone else, because what I appreciated about the Occupy moment was that those were always people who you could talk to about any issue. And it was a really great way of educating people on many different issues that required attention.
So I think what we're seeing from the police, because you talked about this a little, like in the beginning of this, about Occupy, we're seeing definitive tactics from the federal government to avoid a situation where people are occupied beyond the physical space that they would actually occupy. And a lot of that is with the curfews that are rolling out, with the military being brought out this quickly and this early on, with the police provocateurs and other agent provocateurs, whether they're for whatever group, what have you, people that are willing and actively trying to commit violence and escalate the situation into a more dramatic state, so to speak. But the crackdown at the federal level with the literally implementation of just overt martial law has been to completely avoid any type of situation like Occupy. And it trickles down to where you see even the sheriff of LA County say, yeah, no, if you're here before 6 o'clock, you're a protester. If you're here after 6 o'clock, you're a rioter. There's the line. We're going to round you up in buses. Once we arrest enough people, people will eventually stop showing up once all their friends are in jail. In so many words, that's what he said. And that's going to have the direct opposite effect, and it's intended to, in my opinion, because they want people to escalate, to feel more helpless, to feel like a caged animal that is just isolated, surrounded by these men in blue. So I'm honestly scared of what the governmental forces and larger institutions are going to escalate this into as a way to take our rights away.
Yeah, I think that, if I'm right, that sheriff also said that the protesters have the blood of George Floyd on their hands because they've been engaged in violence too, even though that doesn't make any sense because he was dead before that violence happened. So as far as the timeline, but yeah, I agree. we're in this moment right now where people are really daring the police, and the police are not willing to back down. They're not willing to accept that they answer to the people. And we know that the police forces aren't going to back down. But the question is, our elected officials, the people who get voted in and out of office at state and city level and, let's say, county level, are they going to recognize that they, in reality, actually do control the police? Like, are they going to let the police department act like a mafia and push them around, or are they going to recognize that they hold power and can control budgets and can make decisions? We're seeing a little bit of that because the Minnesota state is deciding that they're going to place the Minneapolis Police Department, which was, of course, responsible for George Floyd's murder, place them under an investigation and look at the last decade of their conduct and expose how they operate. Potentially, they're going to embarrass the entire police department before the whole world and show how brutal they've been to citizens in the Twin Cities. And the attorney general might prosecute these other officers, might have them charged. So I think what you're raising is a really important issue here of the civil liberties aspect, because as this intensifies, it just becomes a justification for suppressing people and claiming more authority. And it starts to spill into aspects of our life that isn't even related to protest. I'm based in Chicago. We're already seeing that, downtown, we're going to shut down these offices, these buildings. We're not going to have people come to work. We're afraid that there's going to be riots. We're going to protect ourselves. But essential workers like nurses, the doctors who have to go to hospitals, people who need to go into these businesses that are deemed essential that aren't going to close, have to keep working no matter what's happening on the streets. Well, in order to get there, you're going to have to show your ID and get through a checkpoint. That's going to be militarized. That's going to have police or the National Guard manning it. And you're going to have to, convince people that you are who you say you are in order to get by. If they think anything's funny about you, like you might be impersonating someone, then you're going to be in trouble. Which is really like echoes of apartheid in South Africa when you think about it. Like, it's just
or the current apartheid in the West Bank.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
in Gaza. And our police our police forces get IDF training.
Yeah, right.
And this is something that I think that I'm pretty sure the people in the chat and the people that are going to watch this know, but it bears repeating, because that's where you get the let's go shoot up journalists. That's where you get it's okay to empty a can of mace into a 10-year-old girl. It's that kind of just savage quick strike against anyone. Fuck them. I don't care who you are. You're here. You're doing something wrong. I know because I've got the gun. That's how I know. And I'm a little bit surprised that while this martial law is being implemented, that all those people who rushed the Michigan State Capitol with guns aren't coming back out to be like, hey, whoa, maybe it's all right if you knock around people you think are criminal, but now this is martial law again, and this is what got us in a fucking tizzy in the first place. And they're just like, you know what? I'm going to be over here licking boots now. You guys have fun getting shot with rubber bullets.
The issues, people largely don't see it as the same struggle, which is sad, because they were fighting for the right to have a living, ultimately, like the right to travel, the right to freely associate and perform business as they so desire. And for them to descend upon the State House, but then not descend upon the Justice Centers a week later was really disheartening. But here in Cleveland, actually, I got a chance to go out to the BLM protest on Saturday, and it felt like a show. And the term that actually I was speaking with one of my friends today that they used was security theater. That what we're witnessing now isn't the rise of a police state, but it is the recognition that it exists and the hard turn for people, essentially like the breaking of a bull, where to get a wild animal to commit to you as an owner, you have to pound its head against the wall or shock it or some other terribly inhumane thing, so that way you can continue treating it humanely. And that feels like what this is ultimately going to become, is not that the police state has started to expand, but that it is here, and without drastic action, it is not going to go away. It is going to break our necks and throw us on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it hasn't exactly expanded. A lot of these tools and the equipment that they had have been in there. So to add to what you're saying, like a lot of this stuff existed. There's nothing that our governments have done that has added to the arsenal. All of this was just lying in wait for it to be deployed against us. It shows you what they have available when the uprising comes, when the people rebel. It shows how quickly they can deploy it. And I don't personally expect to engage in any looting or arson. It's just not a tactic that I would personally employ. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that as far as the moment that we're in goes, what they're doing is actually essential to the political moment, because what they're doing is they're creating a threat for the state. They're making it so they have to do something for the peaceful protesters. So because the state governments or federal government being part of the state, because they don't want more windows to be broken. They don't want more shops destroyed. They don't want police precincts burned down. They don't want to see the Macy's or the Target superstores or whatever. They don't want to see those destroyed. Places where people work, they don't want to see those places destroyed. They're going to pay attention to what the peaceful protesters are saying. They're going to listen to what people on the ground are talking about. And it's like, if you didn't have that, if you just had people in the streets marching peacefully and nothing happening at night with people, if you didn't have this fear that when the darkness comes, people are going to take to the streets and there's going to be mayhem, then during the daytime, there really wouldn't be any coverage of the protests in the streets. They'd just be ignored. We wouldn't see that there were thousands of Black Lives Matter protesters throughout the country challenging police. I mean, maybe it would break in and they'd show images because police were surrounding them and they were thinking that there was going to be some kind of conflict and chaos. And then it's ratings, right? They like to show police cracking down on protesters. It's good television. But by and large, these protests probably wouldn't be, it probably wouldn't be shown if there wasn't some kind of threat. Like if we didn't have in the narrative this thing of like when the sun goes down, we have to be afraid for what's going to happen in our cities.
So I don't know how much time you have left, Kevin. We do have a couple of questions that came in from the chat, and I want to make sure that we get that asked. Rob Juno, by the way, thank you for the super chat, brother. You fucking rock. Where does Kevin see advantages in this chaotic U.S. crisis mismanagement?
Yeah. So the advantage, like I said, is I think Julian Assange, that prosecution can become a foreign policy issue. I think, let's not forget that we look at it as, his rights are being violated. We look at it as, that shouldn't be happening because we should have freedom of the press. And we all benefited from this information, and the WikiLeaks shouldn't be punished, and you shouldn't silence journalists. And those are both important. I don't think that this point I'm making here is more important than those two things. Like, we should probably stick to that being a focus of our conversation. But when we have these longer discussions, you might get to the fact that it's really embarrassing that the United States is prosecuting Julian Assange. And it hurts the credibility. And nobody wants to be seen, if they're a superpower, as an enemy of press freedom. And the United States wants to say that they're better than the Chinese government. They want to say they're better than the Russian government. They want to say they're better than the Iranian government or the Venezuelan government or any of the United States enemies of the week. They want to tell people that they're better than them. It's really hard to say that when you're prosecuting Julian Assange. And then also, like, dually, as far as foreign policy issues go, you have the case around Harry Dunn, and the fact that family can't get the person responsible for his death extradited back to the United Kingdom. Well, at the same time, Julian Assange there's a demand that he be extradited to the U.S. So I had multiple people while I was in the UK, people who were driving cars who picked me up to drive me back to my hotel that, when I said I'm in London to cover Julian Assange's hearing, they would say, oh, and then they would bring up this thing with Harry Dunn and how they were really upset. And one driver even told me that they were like, look, if Harry Dunn's murderer can't be extradited to the UK, there's no way that the United States should be able to get Julian Assange. There's no way, because that's just not fair. How can extradition work in such a way that the UK can't get people who kill, but yet you automatically are expected to give up Julian Assange, who, by the way, didn't kill anybody. There's nobody that he murdered, and yet it's simple, and everyone thinks like it's cut and dry that he should be brought back to the United States. And it's like we're talking about this extradition treaty, and the U.S. is completely flouting it and defying the ability of the UK to bring back somebody connected to the intelligence services to hold them accountable. And yet at the same time, they think it should be just swift and easy to get Julian Assange to the United States. I think those are issues. Those are places where you can apply pressure in order to make it difficult for Assange to be punished unjustly.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I can be around for a little longer too if you have more than one.
Okay. So I had Jared Beck on. Oh, hang on, I dropped some. There we go. I had Jared Beck on my show on Sunday, and we were talking about just the state of this chaos, and he brought up Plato's Republic, and said in the Republic, the phase of sort of organized or disorganized government after an oligarchy is small d democracy, which is essentially mob rule, just majority rule. Not an organized republic, but demos of the people, small d democracy. And we got on the idea that we may be seeing the end of rule by oligarchy and the electoral system that we've all grown up under. Do you see any possibility of that occurring? I mean, because to be perfectly honest, it's going to be 20 to 30 years of chaos and strife when that happens. But do you see that as a plausible scenario?
Yeah, I actually do. And the way I'm going to phrase this may come out as seeming hopeful. And if somebody takes this message and runs with it and feels like it's hopeful, I think that's fair. I mean, depending on my mood, I may find it inspiring and hopeful, but I also understand that there are ominous aspects to it because, as we're saying, it could be mob rule. But, I get the sense that, we know where the Republicans stand. We know what they absolutely would like to see. It's basically fascism in the United States. I mean, it's what they've decided to tolerate. They want corporate fascism. And, they pay lip service to libertarian politics, but that's just because there's energy at the grassroots level that they can manipulate during elections. But they don't really care about the Ron Paul crowd and some of those folks who have been really supportive of Julian Assange. And that shows in the way that like Justin Amash has like had to leave the Republican Party because there's not a home for that politics. And then on the other side with Democrats, what you have is them totally resisting a majority of the population and where people stand and what they think should be done in order to help and take care of people, and in the way in which they believe that basic services, very basic services, should be provided to human beings in order to make it easier for people to live, and then to oppose interventions, to roll back military interventions, and to do less occupying the world, spend less money on the military, put more funds and resources in to taking care of this country rather than projecting our power around the world. And what I kind of feel like is when you have that vision that was put forward, I'll raise Bernie Sanders' campaign, but it's not limited to that. There's others that we've seen. We've seen Green Party campaigns. We've seen Socialist Party candidates run for president that have caught people's attention. And when you see the coalescing around a Democratic candidate who basically is just a moderate Republican, when you get down to it, Joe Biden is a moderate Republican who comes from, he was the architect of the crime bill. Like, if you want to know why we're going through what we're going through right now, Joe Biden was the architect who helped develop, raising more funds for police, setting up more prisons and jails in the United States, the places that people are going after they get arrested by these cops, the very systems in which they're being incarcerated in temporarily or for the long term now, if they're charged with serious offenses. Joe Biden was involved in making that possible. But I feel like, as resistant as the powers that be have been to what the people and the masses at the grassroots level want, I don't actually think they're going to have the final word. I just don't. I think what we're seeing with the people in the streets is that either the elites are going to respond to what the people would like to have happen, or there's going to be those mobs coming out that are going to force it, that are going to drag people in that direction. And it's not going to be pretty the way we get there. I think that's what we're seeing, is it's going to be hurtful and messy the way we get there, but you're going to have these sparks because police are going to continue to commit violence, and that's going to set off communities. And I think it might become more frequent. I mean, the last time we were talking about this, it was with Ferguson, it was with Baltimore, but now we've seen in the last week to 2 weeks, we've had sustained rioting for a week, and we've had multiple examples that people could respond to. There was George Floyd, but in the time that we've had people protesting and uprising and mass rebellion, we've had more people get killed by the police who could be the new George Floyd. We've got new George Floyds that people could be mobilizing for and say, that's the thing now that we're going out in the streets for. So what I'm saying is there's going to be more sparks. It's going to be more frequent and messy. And I think that elites are going to find that they have lost the ability to govern, that the people are becoming ungovernable. And when you lose the monopoly of violence over society, then you have become a failed state, and you are in a predicament. And the only way that you can get out of that is you have to offer people something so that they no longer act like this. But so far, I haven't seen a lot from people in power where they're aware that they have to offer something to people in order to calm down the masses who are in despair. Everyone's hurting and in despair. I mean, when you have 40 million people out of work, how can you say that that's a functioning society? How can you say that when people don't know where they're going to draw their income on a weekly basis, that you have a country that is, and people are going to turn to crime, people are going to turn to whatever in order to survive. They're going to turn to illicit, whatever they can do. I mean, unregulated acts in order to get by. And I don't see how we're going to be able to condemn them, because you have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, what would you do in order to put food on the table for your family. But then you're going to see the breakdown of society because people are coming up with new ways in order to survive. So the government has its own choices to make. The people in power have their own choices to make. And if they don't make the right choices, there are going to be consequences. And like, I'm not making a violent or any kind of threat here on this medium. Let's be very clear. I mean, I don't want anyone who's monitoring you on YouTube to think that I'm issuing some threat to government officials. But the fact is now, policy-wise,
So ironically, we call him Kevin.
So if any policies are chosen, and if you're not making the right choices policy-wise, then you're going to see people enraged, and there's going to be consequences for not doing something to take care of the people.
And I don't think that anything that you said was a call to violence. It was literally just a, hey, this is the situation that we're in. It was just a conceptual understanding of the world that was presented to us. Part of our call to action this week actually is asking people, as we have from the very beginning, to not let Julian Assange get lost in everything else that's happening. So we're asking people to go out and join in the Yellow Ribbons campaign if they're a international or national viewer, but also to go out to these protests with signs for Julian. But also to do what other activist groups refer to as wheat pasting, what I consider postering, but going out and putting up free Assange posters during these protests. Like as you're walking down the street, bring duct tape and some signs with you and just put them up on the telephone poles as you go. So that way, as others come, they see that as well. Because this is a big opportunity for us to raise the issue of a free press because of just the raw amount of people being assaulted. And this is kind of a question off topic from what we were just sort of discussing, but what do you think, Kevin, would be the best ways to make sure that Julian doesn't get lost, but also to bring his struggle as a message of solidarity to other groups?
Yeah. So as we wrap, I'll get to your answer, but there's something that's been to your question, but there's something that's been on my mind related to this upcoming hearing that's going to happen in September that I've been concerned about because I'm not sure that COVID-19 is going to be exactly out of the picture. We don't really know what it's going to do. We don't really know the character of this virus, and that's true in the United States and all over the world. And so what's it going to be like for people who want to travel to Julian Assange's hearing? And what's it going to be like for the journalists that want to travel to Julian Assange's hearing? So right now, I'm really concerned because in the last week and the last administrative or case management hearings that we've seen with Julian Assange, we can tell that the court is completely bumbling this in such a way that it's denying due process rights to Julian Assange because it's impossible for more than 6 journalists to tune in to what is happening in the case. And I mean that there's 6 people who are allowed to go into the court and witness, but they have this phone line that I've been reading about. I haven't called in because that would mean calling in at 3 a.m. and I value my sleep a little bit too much. But the people who do try to call in, if they're, let's say, in Europe, they're not able to get into this phone number and actually access and hear what's happening with Julian Assange's hearing. And so we're losing reporting. And I think that's that for people who are trying to build solidarity for Julian Assange, it's important to understand that when journalists can't get updates on what's happening with Julian Assange, when they can't hear those case management hearings and get those updates from the court, from his lawyers, from Julian himself, from people who are representatives of Julian, if there's anyone in the courtroom speaking additionally on his behalf, then that's when coverage dries up. That's when people don't pay attention. I mean, if they can't do it, then a lot of people just don't bother. And then that blackout is a really bad thing for Julian Assange's case. So I do kind of feel like there should be some pressure on, if we're talking about solidarity, I think what might be needed is there should be some pressure on the court right now to resolve this issue of what's the venue going to be, first of all, where they're going to hold this hearing in September. They still haven't established that, and that's a huge problem for Julian Assange and his team because it makes it difficult for them to prepare for what's coming up. And two, well, what's access going to be like? How many journalists are going to be allowed in? How many people from the public are going to be allowed to attend these proceedings? What kind of transparency is Julian Assange going to have for this major 3-week hearing that witnesses are going to be testifying at? What's going to happen for those witnesses? How are they going to participate in the hearing? Are they going to join by video, or do they have to go to the court? Some of those witnesses can't travel. Like if Noam Chomsky is expected to travel to London during COVID-19 and he's a 93-year-old man, how is he going to testify in defense of Julian Assange? I assume he's just going to submit an affidavit in order to protect himself. But that's less powerful than actually hearing Noam Chomsky speak on Julian Assange's behalf. So we have to be asking these questions about what's the court going to do to accommodate justice and protect the due process rights? Because so far it has failed miserably and magnificently, because we've seen this glass box where he can't hear what's happening in these proceedings. And now we've got this phone mechanism that journalists can't use, but that's supposed to be okay. We've seen how he can't get bail, how he won't be placed on home confinement. We've seen how the judge just completely doesn't care if Julian Assange knows or doesn't know what's developing in his case. They don't care if he's not able to join by video because of his health. And that's wrong. That's tremendously wrong, because there's just no way we can expect him to know what's happening in these proceedings and where things are at in his case if that's the way he's being abused and mistreated. And I do feel like, if I had to think of where I would focus my attention, I would be demanding that the court give us some answers and take this seriously and resolve these issues immediately, because people need to plan, and Julian Assange has to be able to prepare his case. And by not knowing this information, it's really difficult to get set for September. And he's not able to meet with his lawyers. That's a big issue. Right now, because he doesn't want to get sick. Worse in Belmarsh, he's having almost maybe one conversation with lawyers, it seems, from the reporting we're getting. Every 6 to 8 weeks, it seems like he's managed to get a conversation with his lawyers. It's really not good if you're developing your defense. I can't stress enough how pivotal this hearing is going to be, these 3 weeks that they had put witnesses on. From what I've heard, this is the show. This is the big moment that Julian Assange has to prove that it is wrong for the United States government to extradite him. And while it may not matter because Vanessa Baretzer is going to rule against him anyways, if that's true, still, that evidence has to be on the record in this proceeding so that it can be mentioned and invoked during the appeal as a thing that Vanessa ignored and should have given more weight and credence to and considered. And that's why she should have rejected his extradition. So everything that they put on the record is incredibly important for Julian Assange if he wants to be freed, because everything builds off of this hearing at the they're either going to do it at Woolwich Court or they're going to do it at the Westminster Magistrate Court, wherever they decide to do it. This hearing is crucial for what happens over the next 2 to 3 years, because everything that we hear in the appeals, there's not going to be much new evidence. Everything is going to be going back to how the judge handled that evidence and what the judge ignored or didn't ignore and should have. And so I think that we need to really focus on getting this hearing right and making sure that there isn't a media blackout around this hearing, not because journalists don't want to cover it, but because the court doesn't allow for access. And I'm wondering how many journalists are really going to want to risk their lives and go to this hearing if they still think that there's COVID-19 spreading in the UK. And so maybe there needs to be some way that the court can accommodate people remotely. I mean, maybe we need to be pushing the court to develop some kind of a well, idealistically, if I was aiming for that thing that we're never going to get to happen, but we should fight for because activism is about shooting for the clouds, it should be that there would be a live stream of Julian Assange's 3-week extradition hearing, because COVID-19 has made it impossible for people to gather in a courthouse.
Yeah, and gather outside of a courthouse. Apparently, we found that out just yesterday morning. The UK and Vanessa Baraitster, who I've been referring to as the concierge for the U.S. State Department, although I'm told that concierge is too nice of a term for what she's doing. They're setting brand new standards on how to discard precedent and rule of law based on the way they're dealing with Julian. Kevin, I can't thank you enough for coming on the vigil this evening. I do hope you'll return. I'm going to have to try and I'm gonna have to get you on Slow News Day if you don't mind. I think we could have a stretched out and decent conversation over there as well.
Yeah.
Will you please let everyone know what your outlet is and where they can find you on social media and maybe what you've got going on that they should look for in the next week or two?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm on social media at Gosztola on Twitter. That's my handle that you can find, KGOSZTOLA. I host a podcast weekly called Unauthorized Disclosure. It's a really appropriate name for what I do with whistleblowers and covering WikiLeaks. But mind you, we talk about just about everything. So, and weekly on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern, which I guess would make it 9 London time, I do a Dissenter Weekly show, which is updates on whistleblower stories from the past week, as well as updates on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks related stories. I cram a bunch of different headlines into a half hour and give people these updates as my way of, without getting dragged into another discussion, just so I can make sure people know what this show's about, is about transcending this discussion of whistleblowers in a partisan manner, because we had a lot of conversation last year around this Ukraine call whistleblower, and it suddenly seemed like people cared about whistleblowers, and I was like, well, yeah, whistleblower, you have to put it in air quotes, because this guy definitely had some agenda, and by the way, that agenda was to continue arming Ukrainians against the Russians. But yeah, so whistleblowing is a total partisan thing, and this show is to show people that there are so many whistleblower stories happening on a weekly basis that just are completely ignored by the mainstream media. And so you can see that. So thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
Hell yeah. So make sure that for the guys watching and the folks watching in the chat right now, make sure that you follow Kevin on the social medias and that you are tuning into the show. The Whistleblower Show in particular, I find incredibly educational and fascinating. And we're going to start using that to reach out to potential guests to the vigil. We're going to go ahead and transition over into the news segment now. I should probably look to see what the first article in the queue is. And Kevin, you can just close out whenever you want to.
Oh, he opted out already. He just jumped out.
Okay.
But our first article for tonight is the new statement by Doctors for Assange, or alongside of Doctors for Assange. And this is just multiple different influential members of governments that are speaking out and signing this same letter in support of him. So I just think it's super important to highlight stuff like this when it happens, because it shows that there is a larger level of support for Julian, and more than just street activism or on the internet. It's actually, to some, even in the smallest degree, exists within the halls of power. So do you want to pick up reading through this real quick, Steve?
I'm gonna have to take it off of the thing here. So sure, or go ahead, Kendra.
I was just going to say I have it up, so I can go ahead and. So, dear sir, request for compassionate release of Julian Assange. As current and former elected representatives in democracies committed to human rights, the presumption of innocence and the rule of law, we wish to support the urgent appeal sent to you by Australian MPs Andrew Wilkie and George Christensen, who wrote, "We ask that you urgently reconsider providing Mr. Assange with release from Belmarsh Prison to monitored home detention, as he fits all of the grounds noted for such early release by leading organizations as the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the UK Prison Officers Association. These organizations have been unanimous in calling for the release of all nonviolent COVID-19 prisoners, and we ask that you give compassionate consideration to the following. Mr. Assange is a nonviolent remand prisoner with no history of harm to the community. He is not convicted and is thus entitled to the presumption of innocence. Doctors of Mr. Assange warn he is at high risk from dying if he contracts COVID-19, as he has pre-existing chronic lung condition. We are advised that COVID-19 is rapidly spreading throughout UK prisons and that there are infections and at least one death at Belmarsh Prison. We understand that the prison is short-staffed and normal activity regimes are suspended. Mr. Assange is in poor mental health due to spending so much time in solitary confinement over recent years, and prison COVID-19 lockdown measures are further undermining his mental health. We ask that you give further consideration to the very reasonable request by Mr. Assange's lawyers that this non-violent Australian prisoner be released into home detention with a 24-hour ankle monitor. With the director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention warning of a second wave of coronavirus during influenza season, we stress that even those vulnerable prisoners such as Julian Assange who survived the current crisis remain at risk." And then yours sincerely, you have, I think it would be good to go ahead and read these through. Dr. Arthur Chesterfield Evans, and he's from Australia, Claire Daly from Ireland, Andrew Feinstein from South Africa, Mike Graval, which is great to see a former US Senator on there, Helke Hansel, member of the German Bundestag, Eva Joly, she's a member of the former member of the European Parliament of France. This one I'm going to murder. Ogmundur Jonasson, former member of the Icelandic Parliament. Ron Paul, former US Congressman. Yanis, member of the Greek Parliament. Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament of Ireland. And Chris Williamson, former member of Parliament, United Kingdom. So one thing I would say is we need some more active members. What do you guys think?
I was honestly hoping when I saw Ron Paul had signed this that Rand had signed it as well, but he does not have his signature on there. It's actually part of our pressure campaign this week to contact Jim Jordan, Thomas Massey, and Ron Paul Rand Paul, because there was multiple different people that asked for Republican senators to be contacted. So maybe it would even be effective to share this letter with him and be like, hey, this is what your colleagues are doing. How can you participate?
I agree. I think that's a great idea. Should we go ahead and move on to the, and really everybody, anybody who's an active member of Congress should be responding to this. I do think that was a good thing that we went over earlier, is that just we see other parts of the First Amendment eroding before our eyes, and without a free press, we can already see that, you're not necessarily going to get the honest picture there. So
it's one of those things where it draws back the curtain when you've got an entire group of partisans as the Democrats who are their main message is, we can't afford 4 more years of Trump. Trump is orange man bad. Everything he's ever done is an affront to the Constitution and normalcy and morality, except for when he bombs the shit out of brown people, when he tries to overthrow brown people, or when he's slowly murdering Julian Assange. That's cool. Trump's great on that if you're part of the Democratic leadership. Oh, and all of those right-wing judges that he appointed to lifetime positions on lower court benches, yeah, those guys are cool too. But the optics have to say that, you know, this guy is an existential threat to the American way of life and Vladimir Putin's puppet. And because he's Vladimir Putin's puppet, we're going to give him $130 million more than he asked for to go make war.
Bingo.
Yeah, let's go ahead and pull up the Wise Up Action article, because this is serious shit, and we need to talk about it, and hopefully we can roll a little bit of tape on it too. So Wise Up Action is the activist newsletter that our own MEB puts out as often as possible, and we'll just jump right into it so we can watch and listen to what went down with you guys. It is extremely important every single time that Julian Assange's case is in court, media and public attend the hearings and witness the events. In this, the most important press freedom case our societies have grappled with for 100 years, we see a publisher pilloried by the establishment he embarrassed with his publications. But as he stands trapped at the pillory, he is met by a cheering crowd and not by Pillary's archetypal ravenous mob. He is a hero and an inspiration to nations around the world. We delivered to the court listings clerk a petition for District Judge Vanessa Barrister. Can we run that video, please, Josh? And I will mute. Some the bitch. Get all? Oh, wow. That's garbage. Right? That's so weird. It's playing on mine.
Yeah, it's working on mine too.
Well, then moving along, we had to deal with a policeman who told us the court building was private property and requested we remove our banner from the railing, while surprisingly, he was in plain clothing and refused to explain why he was not wearing his uniform. This, if you go to either the website wiseupaction.info or I believe a number of friends of the vigil as well have this up on their own Twitter feeds. Tara Kadat, I know, does. Muhammad Almazi, a number of other people who were inside the courtroom at Belmarsh while this took place. It is fucking wild, y'all. Only 5 members of the public were admitted to court number 10 due to COVID-19 social distancing rules. You can read freelance journalist Muhammad Almazi's report from the court at Sputnik, which we're going to get into momentarily. The court's police liaison officer, this time wearing his uniform, provided us with telephone dial-in access to the court proceeding. To my great disappointment, we were not given instructions on how to do this. When I dialed in and the poor sound quality prevented me from hearing anything, I approached the court to complain and ask for assistance. She was not able to assist, but I had a 1-minute conversation with her on this issue. Unbeknownst to me, the conversation was being overheard by all dial-in participants. That is to say, the court telephone dial-in system had no administrator monitoring the call, and there was no provision about muting the audience. Simply unbelievable lack of organization. Luckily, I was alerted at the fact and was able to keep quiet for the rest of the proceedings. I must say that whilst I was grateful for the access, sitting outside the courtroom, I could hear Vanessa Barrister's voice slightly better through the courtroom wall than on the phone. And then there's a report for the hearing here. I don't know if we want to get into this or if we just want to roll through the pictures and go to Mo's. It is up to you.
I'd say we just go to Mo's with it because his article is really well written.
All right.
He did a wonderful job.
And then again, just I can't hit this hard enough. They're on a public street in front of a public courtroom that UK taxpayer funds paid to build, maintain, operate, and pay the salary of everyone inside. And a plainclothes cop comes up to them and says, you can't have that here. You can, and then just sits there and argues with them like a petulant fucking toddler for the next couple of minutes. So I don't know. Did somebody want to jump into
Well, I was just going to say this whole situation that she's describing, just to pull us aside for a minute, is literally what we saw last time at the last court hearing, where they were chased away by the police because of social distancing laws, even though they were in violation of none of them. But yeah, we can jump over to Mohammed's article now.
Well, also just like, I mean, a few days before they had the big march for George, or, you know, gathering for George Floyd in Trafalgar Square, or, you know what I mean? So that's also like, there's part of me when I saw that, I'm just like, is this guy just, you know, feeling powerless, like needs to, you know, push on a couple people outside the courtroom?
He's probably getting a little inspired by what he sees in the U.S. to go try and rough people up.
Glad he didn't do that.
So this next article, it is Julian Assange doesn't attend latest hearing as judge fails to secure new court venue. And just to kind of catch people up, and it touches on it a little bit in here. For the last, at this point, I think it's been 4 or 5 now, court hearings, Julian Assange has been said he is unable to attend 4 hearings due to being unwell. And there was never really clarification given. There was never ever an answer for it. And the first time it happened, it was largely, well, this isn't good. And then now that this is the 4th time, this is like a critical issue at this point, because we do know that there's been deaths from coronavirus in there. But it starts off, the second part of the extradition case of the WikiLeaks publisher has been delayed due to COVID-19 lockdown. Judge Vanessa Braister refuses to grant him bail despite the threat posed to prisoners from the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. Judge Vanessa Braister failed to inform the parties in Julian Assange's extradition case that Part 2 of the hearing will be held during the latest call-over hearing at Westminster Court on 1 June 2020. The judge said that she had hoped to be able to provide the name of the Crown Court that would hear the case, but I am still awaiting confirmation as to where it will be. Judge Braister had agreed with the parties that the WikiLeaks publisher's case would need to be delayed from May to September due to the inability of the parties to be present in court amid the COVID-19 pandemic. She also agreed that it would assist everyone if a separate court venue could be found, since Belmarsh's magistrate court has no availability in September. Though Judge Braister did note towards the end of the hearing on April 27th that the venue will ultimately find maybe outside of London. Mr. Assange did not attend the hearing via video link. Edward Fitzgerald, QC, acting for the defense, told the judge in a letter that was sent to the court on Friday from Mr. Assange's, I don't know what that word is, solicitor. Solicitor Garth Pierce, noting that the history of the respiratory problems mean that it is too dangerous for him to attend the hearing using the video link room in the British prison. The judge had previously ruled that if the prison officials determined it was safe, then Mr. Assange must attend the call-over hearing every 28 days, irrespective of the independent medical advice he received, unless he was unwell. This is despite the fact that at least 2 prisoners in Belmarsh prison have died of COVID-19 by that time. Judge Braister asked Mr. Fitzgerald, who was attending via audio link, whether Mr. Assange was unwell, and he answered with an affirmative. She has refused to grant Mr. Assange bail despite being told that he was at great risk for the sickness and death due to this history of respiratory problems. Mr. Assange's next call-over hearing has been set for 29 June.
So that, I mean, so it's one of those things that's hard to really accurately break down because we have an incomplete picture, but the way that I understand it is the video link room where he would go to do these, you know, quote unquote in-person appearances is infrequently sanitized and a hub of where all prisoners go for a video conferencing court appearance. So if the Belmarsh medical staff is saying, no, it's in your best interest not to go to this appearance, then I personally feel a little bit better about it. But we can't discount the fact that Julian Assange is in poor health, has been in poor health, showed up with a chronic lung condition that he got from being in fucking jail in 2010, and is at a much higher risk of succumbing to not just COVID, but any number of illnesses you can pick up in a prison. I really like, I gotta believe that the man won't pass away in jail. I do, you know, and I gotta believe that him not showing up for the video link at the behest of his doctors is a good thing, because that would mean that there's a greater opportunity for recovery if you're not exposing yourself, going out of your way to expose yourself to any sort of pathogen. I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think he just needs to be granted bail and let out of prison.
Well,
I
fuck yeah.
think the whole fucking charade, not that like no one here in viewing doesn't feel that same way, but like it's bullshit. The fact that he has to fucking be in there during this entire thing is literally the process, or the punishment by process that is talked about so often, where it's not the fact that he is or isn't guilty of a crime, it's that people possess the ability to remove his humanity in that way.
Well, and just the even, I mean, and I know we've talked about it before, but even our own experiences of being, you know, at home or quarantined or anything like that, just for, you know, with a limited amount of time, you know, I mean, you go a little bit stir crazy yourself, you know, to imagine that for, I mean, the treatment that he went under before, and then even before that, he was also in solitary. And then now, especially with the COVID, he's completely, you know, 23 hours a day in a cell. I mean, that's torture in itself. I mean, can you imagine that? And still doesn't have a radio, doesn't have, I mean, what does he even have in there? We don't know. Does he have any reading materials? Does he have, one thing that I would note is I did see that he is receiving letters. So that is one helpful thing that people can do is, you know, write to Julian. And there are, you know, there's information on that, and we could probably post that too. But that is one thing I think that he's allowed to do in there is get letters. So that would be a good thing for us to do. Oh,
Sorry, I'm like,
sorry guys, you can't see, but Andrew is having a coughing fit. So
I was choking on my own spit. But yeah, go to, if you do want to send letters, there's really specific requirements for people to do so. And it's to try to prevent more letters from reaching Julian. But I believe the website's just writejulian.com. If you go to the Action for Assange site, we have it linked on there. You just look up like letters or write in our search box and it pops right up. But I think a couple more articles here. We have, do you want to look at Christian statements real quick before we move into anything Assange related?
Yeah, hopefully the video will play this time.
This is
the persecution of WikiLeaks and our publisher Julian Assange would set a terrifying trend, and we have been right. In the last few days, we've seen an example of this, where armed police have gone after journalists who have been covering the protests following the brutal killing of George Floyd. They have been beaten up, they have been suffering for the use of tear gas and pepper spray and the threat of live ammunition. And the police have been urged on by President Trump tweeting from his bunker. This is of serious concern to everybody. Free flow of information is the oxygen of democracy. If journalists can't breathe, democracy will die. So we must stand up, unite together for journalism and for Julian Assange. His freedom is essential in that fight. In this morning's hearing at the Westminster Magistrate Court, journalists were trying to call in to get information about the proceeding in its fight against extradition to the United States. They couldn't hear anything. We learned afterwards that even though a date has been set in early September for the continuation of the hearing, a venue still hasn't been found. So it's utter shambles. But there's much at stake. The general public, and especially journalists, must unite in this fight. Our democracy is at stake, our future is at stake, and the future of our children.
So, in spite of the grim tone in this, I love Kristen Ramson's message because it sounds like maybe he's been watching the vigils, because we've said more or less all of that stuff numerous amounts of times. How many times have you heard us say without free flow without a free flow of information, like whatever it is you stand for is fucking done? You know, we don't, and this is one of those things, I know Andrew brought it up, it's worth reiterating. If you are one of those people who is going out into the streets to protest with everyone else under the freaking sun that can get there, try to have conversations about Julian Assange. If you bring a sign, have Julian's name on one side of it, and have George Floyd's or whatever else you want on the side that you're walking facing forward. Switch it around from time to time. I went down to Santa Cruz on Sunday and participated in the March of Kittens that is a protest in Santa Cruz. We did have our Santa Cruz police chief take a knee right next to the mayor for a moment of silence. The mayor is a 30-year-old cat named Justin Cummings. He was on one of the earliest episodes of Slow News Day before he even knew that he was elected to the city council, let alone was going to be elected mayor. Yeah, that's performative. Yes, a police chief taking a knee with directly next to a black guy who's also the mayor is performative because they don't want their town destroyed. But at the same time, we did see one of the sheriffs where Flynn is, Michigan, Genesee County, literally take his helmet off and set it on the ground and set his baton down on the ground and walk over and join the people who were protesting. And that is something that will make or break these protests. When I talked to Danny Sherson most recently, he said that it wasn't just anti-war protests that were going on stateside that helped bring about the end of Vietnam. What did it was the number of soldiers who were like, not gonna fight. The soldiers that fragged superior officers, the soldiers that refused to follow orders. That is the kind of movement that it takes in order to see significant change and an end to in the case of Vietnam, violence against the Vietnamese. In the case of the United States, that is what it would take to stop the violence that pigs perpetrate on innocent citizens, or not so innocent citizens, but unarmed citizens. We got to see that. I don't know how to reach them. I don't know how to talk to the police. I don't talk to the police. It's not a habit of mine.
So here in Ohio, I had my personal experience and the experience of my friend in a much different town. here in Cleveland, it was literally just warfare. Like the police were just being assholes. I don't want to get into my story too much. If people ask personally offline, I'll talk about it. But long story short, the police in Cleveland were, and will continue to provoke the violence. And something that I saw actually that I thought was really inspiring, one of the protests in a smaller city close to where I live called Lorraine featured the police in the protests with the people out on the street. And it was very showy. It was very much a like, hey, let's not have anything go crazy in our city for the most part. But it still happened, and it's a start. And I don't think, to Steve's question about reaching the police, I don't think you can get them as a group. You reach them as individual people, because at the end of the day, each one of them still has a beating heart in their chest, no matter how depraved of an action they could have taken 6 minutes or 6 years down the road against someone for a nonviolent offense or anything. But one of the things here that happened in Cleveland, there was a girl that got hit with a smoke grenade. Exploded right under her feet, caused her to drop to the ground, go into, I don't know, like respiratory failure or some kind of seizure. And the police literally line moved up to where this girl was to try and help her. And there was a group of us that literally just told the police no, just said, we don't want any more violence. You have caused this, go away. And the shock in the officers' faces, at least the one or two of them that were actually listening, you saw them thinking about what the fuck they were actually doing when it was the person that they hurt that the crowd then said, no, you cannot help them, you hurt them. I feel like at least on that individual level with the one or two officers that were actually listening and conscious in that moment, it hopefully made some type of impact on them, because it was the only time where an officer shook someone's hand or walked away and realized that they weren't there for the greater good, so to speak.
Well, and I think too that that's that's something that we have to look at here, is that it's going to be difficult for it'll be difficult for people to come together, but I think that's a really important thing. I think that's why it's so important that we push and try to at least bring Julian Assange to light and WikiLeaks to light, and have people start reading some of this information that's available out there. Because, when you look even at history, like the police, I mean, if we just focus on them and not the bigger problem of the militarization and what's happened, you know what I mean, with, how did they even get that way in the first place? It's like it's like an Eichmann trial, where you're just it's that banality of evil that it's just become normalized, and that takes a lot to fight through. I mean, it really does. And it's just, and I think that the divisions that we see here, I hope that people can come together. I hope, to your point, Andrew, that you see the same people that were out there wanting the right to work, that they say, you know what, we have a common ground here, and that we all just kind of really try to start focusing on that, even with people that just piss you off, that you're thinking about that. And I know we all have them from each different side. And I think though, with, especially with people who do support WikiLeaks, even though they might vehemently disagree with each other, they agree with each other on that. And I hope that can be, a common ground that people can come to.
I'm actually happy to see in literally the last 3 days the term legal monopoly on violence become commonplace within the independent media, because we've been subjected to a lot of new terminology within the last fucking 4 months now, like the state-run media terms like social distancing and flattening the curve. But it seems like there's now independent media being able to inject words like that, like legal monopoly on violence and stuff along those lines, that gives people a wholly different perspective. Because before this, most people never talked about the security state in independent media. So I hope that this can be a stepping stone to getting people to talk about more actually in-depth security state issues too.
Yeah, that is a solid point, so there's a double-edged sword to it, because when you start to make place or make commonplace the parlance of activism, that's when those words get co-opted and turned into meaningless phrases. But you can if we can maintain the pressure that is currently being put on a system that has intentionally hollowed itself out, then that is what helps break the system. So more important than getting media to accept and use the terminology of activism is getting regular everyday people to accept and use the language of activism. And we have a real opportunity to do that now, especially because nobody's talking about the fucking virus anymore. Like that, it was gone. And I'm sure that there will always be another crisis of a similar nature. It may not be COVID-20 that we see later on this fall, but
well, if you look at programs like Lockstep, this type of social unrest is actually mapped out in a way that they're going to control people through a pandemic situation. And we have an article from Sputnik that talks about the current police state that's being rolled out. But what I think that they're going to use the pandemic for is allowing this contact tracing and then forcibly housing dissidents to where, you attended a protest, you have a virus. Yeah.
Did you see that in Minnesota and Minneapolis? Yeah, they came out and they were like, "Oh, we're surprised. Who knew it could be used for this?" But the exact same technology that we have for contact tracing can now be used to hunt protesters. I had no idea, Jim. Did you? No, sure didn't, Bob. It was just the darndest thing.
Good thing Privacy International let everybody know that contact tracing is okay. Like, I'm really proud of them for putting out such a 2,000, 3,000 word piece about how we have to accept contact tracing. Like, I'm just so glad that international privacy institution decided to literally just burn whatever it stood for. We do actually have that article, though, if we want to get into that, about the contact tracing in Minnesota. I think it's Article 6 that we have. It's our last one on the list.
Yeah.
You want me to start reading?
Other one, Josh, I'm sorry. The one that's listed as 6. It should be the very last one that's on there. Oh, yeah, you can.
The don't mix policing.
Oh, the Electronic Frontier Foundation article. Okie doke.
Okay. So this article, Don't Mix Policing with COVID-19 Contact Tracing by Adam Schwartz. So over the weekend, Minnesota's Public Safety Commissioner, now here's my word, analogized COVID-19 contact tracing with police investigation of arrested protesters. This analogy is misleading and dangerous. It also underlies the need for public health officials to practice strict data minimization, including a ban on sharing with police any personal information collected through contact tracing. On May 30th, at a press conference about the ongoing protests in Minneapolis against racism and police brutality, Commissioner John Harrington stated, "As we've begun making arrests, we have begun analyzing the data of who we have arrested and begun actually doing what you would think as almost pretty similar to our COVID. It's contact tracing. Who are they associated with? What platforms are they advocating for?" We strongly disagree. Contact tracing, a public health technique used to protect us from a deadly pandemic, or contact tracing is a public health technique used to protect us from a deadly pandemic. In its traditional manual form, not to be confused with automated contact tracing apps, contact tracing involves interviews of people who have been infected to ascertain who they have been in contact with in order to identify other infected people before they infect still more people, which I personally think is bullshit, but I'll let you guys comment on that.
Yeah, I just want to say, even this framing, they basically make it sound okay, that contact tracing is okay, when literally it's a paid snitch squad. It's people whose jobs it is to find out where the fuck you have been that are paid by our government. And if that system, regardless of what it's being used for, and this is my personal opinion, I speak for no one but me in all of this, if it can be used for that, it can be used for anything. That's the way government works. That's the way law works. That's the way it functions. Once that data set has been ascertained, all it takes is a warrant, regardless of anything else. And in many cases, not even a warrant anymore.
Yeah, what did we say right when we got back from DC? And Susie was one of our guests. So, emergency powers, once enacted, seldom ever go away. And this is one of those instances where it doesn't even have to be related to COVID-19. It's the same technology that was brought in because of it that is now being used to flat the fuck out hunt protesters. Sarah Wagner, thank you for the super sticker. That is awesome.
But that next paragraph, right under the one we just finished. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh no, it's all right.
Because that's where this article really takes like a truly Orwellian turn, more so than even just contact tracing in and of itself.
You want me to keep reading?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Here we go. On the other hand, interrogating arrested protesters about their beliefs and associations is a longstanding police practice. So is social media surveillance by police of dissident movements. These practices must be carefully restricted lest they undermine our First Amendment rights to associate, assemble, and protest, and our Fourth Amendment rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. We have similar concerns about a notorious practice that the NSA calls contact chaining, automated analysis of communications metadata in order to identify connections between people. Any blurring of police work with contact tracing can undermine public health. In prior outbreaks, people who trusted public health authorities were more likely to comply with containment efforts. On the other hand, a punitive approach to containment can break that trust. For example, people may avoid testing if they fear the consequences of a test result. Thus, we must ensure strict data minimization in COVID-19 contact tracing. At a minimum, this means that police must have no access to any personal information collected by public health officials in the course of interviewing COVID-19 patients about their movements, activities, and associations. People are less likely to cooperate with contact tracing if they fear the consequences. For this reason, EFF also opposes police access to the home address of COVID-19 patients.
I'm muted. God damn it. No, I mean, this is incredibly powerful language that they're using here. And I mean, the contact chaining, like it, what that basically amounts to, what this whole thing basically amounts to, is bypassing a FISA process. We just had this big basically like a show of how bad the FISA court system is and how just arbitrarily those warrants get handed out. Well, this skips that process altogether. And it uses the same multi-step collection method in terms of who you associate with or who you're in contact with. But instead of going over a mobile line, it's proximity. And Andrew's right. I mean, this is totally going to be used to round up quote unquote dissidents. This is totally going to be used to target people who are in the activism community, who are trying by hook and by crook and by fucking putting their literal lives on the line to enact some not earth-shattering change, but to achieve a level of basic human dignity that we flat the fuck out don't have in the land of the free.
But I also see too, I don't know what you guys think about this, but I mean, like, pushing this contact tracing for this specific situation, which is terrible, that they're using it for that, but then also to even dial that back down to where then people accept contact tracing for the virus, which we'd also talked about, is, it's still a violation of people's civil liberties, and we don't know, you know what I mean? I know people have different viewpoints on that, but whenever I see something like this, I see them do something like this, like kind of overreach and then dial it back to something that was already bad in the first place. I don't know if you guys see that at all, or what you think about that.
I mean, it's already been horrible. We've known that they've had the power to do all of this and have been doing all of it even since before it was legal. And all this is doing is just giving them the public front to scoop people up. It's the black bag squad is what it'll turn into. Oh, you're a political dissident? Well, you have COVID-19. You don't want this vaccine? Well, you're going to our camp. Because there's this really obscure interview, too, just to kind of, I don't know, bring it up, I guess, about a Pentagon official talking about finding a vaccination for like ideological extremism, that they had found a way to basically inject a substance into someone's body that retards the portion of the brain that makes them respond in a way to give a shit about things that are philosophical or ideological. And maybe that's what this is going to try and do. Maybe it's some kind of crazy ass Bill Gates virus that they're going to try to push out, that if you don't accept the poison, you're put into a camp and then slowly burned. Or you take the poison and you lose all sense of self and caring for any type of principled ideology. And it's just to see it, because even when they talked about it, they joked about having it come from some type of influenza virus, that this vaccine would be used on Middle Eastern countries to curb violence against, to curb Muslim extremism. And now it's something that has a very real chance of being deployed here, if not globally.
No, I mean, I agree with that sentiment. I do. Josh, if you could pull up the Candles for Assange upcoming actions so we could run through those here real quick, that would be cool. And yeah, I mean, you guys, the people who are watching right now should know Alex Hills. She started Candles for Assange. So coming up here in 8 days, 10th of June, there is a Defend Craig Murray event. If you guys have not been following the just complete and total persecution that Craig Murray is going through, then perhaps we should have a refresher course over the weekend with somebody from the UK. But Craig Murray is about to get railroaded as well, and he is a former ambassador, not just random independent journalist, but carried a ton of political clout and weight. So July 3rd will be a massive happy birthday, Julian Assange. I would imagine we're going to have something special cooked up for that. The 25th of July, in front of Belmarsh Prison is going to be another action, and you can shout out the Truman Human on the tweeters for that. And then, of course, 5th of September, action for Assange, yours truly, will be back in Washington, D.C., and we have coordinated international events and demonstrations that we're going to be engaged in during that 3-week period, if we can get there. And I fucking just hate asking people for money. Like, I do. It sucks. But we have to crowdfund this. You guys, the audience, pulled through in incredible ways that we had no idea. But it was awesome. So if you can, please do donate. It doesn't matter what the amount is at all. We appreciate the hell out of it. If you can't, man, I can't either. But share the link. And then if YouTube ever lets me stream to YouTube again, of course, like all of my super chats will be going towards that. I've got like 2 months of that I'm waiting to get paid from YouTube for before I can roll that over into the GoFundMe. But that is going to happen. And we're going to be putting together a thank you video here relatively shortly for the people who have donated thus far. So yeah, just consider Action for Assange when you are in the process of supporting independent media.
And something here, just as we wrap up, be careful, everybody. We live in a fucking crazy world. We have a gang of people in blue going around beating the fuck out of everybody with impunity. Just be careful, be smart, help other people. If you see somebody get hurt, please stop and assist them, because if you don't, who will? And that should be a question that we ask ourselves a lot throughout this, that if not us, who, and if not now, when? Because otherwise, what's the point of spending the better part of, I don't know, the last century trying to break whatever enslavement's been brought down upon us? But you can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. You can find us at action_4Assange. And I just want to thank Kevin. I want to thank Kendra and Steve and Josh and also Kimber for her help behind the scenes, and everyone that's watching, because this was a great show tonight with all things considered.
And yes, thank you to my co-host. Thanks for having me on as a guest host. It's always fun to be here. Thank you to our guest Kevin, and to Josh and Kimber, and to everybody in the chat. Really love you guys. And also, one thing I do want to give a slight shout out to the boomers before we go, because like half of our group in Denver are all boomers, and they are awesome. They show up and they're great. So if you want to follow me at edabs13, and if you want to follow Denver Action to Free Assange, that's at DNVFreeJA. So thanks, everyone.
My name is Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day. You can find it on YouTube, I guess, occasionally by typing in Slow News Day podcast into the search bar. I'm also on the Rockfin and D Live. If you are a patron on the Patreon of Slow News Day, please cancel that and endorse the show on the Rockfin. I don't do enough on the Patreon. I really don't, and I have no fucking time. Real quick, in the chat, I just posted a link. The link is to a series of care packages that Anonymous put together during Occupy. It is your crash course in how to be a street medic, and how to help keep the people that you're involved in actions with safe. So please do look at that, study it, share the hell out of it, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I don't think that we've seen the worst of what our government has to throw against its own citizens yet. Huge thanks to Kevin Gosztola for being on the vigil tonight, and to the Mean Panda for the graphics, and Sleepy Josh on the 1s and 2s. Thank you, Kendra, and thank you, Andrew. You guys are fucking awesome. And thank you watching, everyone that's hung out with us in the chat, and everyone that is going to watch after the fact. We love you guys. Now's the time. We have 97 days. Please join the Discord. Please get involved with us as we plan these actions, and as we are rallying more and more people to be with us in DC in September. We quite literally can't do this without you. And we will catch you Saturday. So until then, good luck to us all.